The call came in on a Tuesday afternoon, a day as unremarkable as the suburbs it served. Officer Preston's radio crackled with the kind of low-stakes report that usually ended with a paramedic patting down a senior citizen who'd simply forgotten where they put their glasses. This was a welfare check. A worried son, Jonathan Vance, reporting that his elderly mother, Eleanor, had become unresponsive and unusually drowsy. It was a call that held all the quiet, mundane dread of a slow leak, not the sharp, gut punch of a bursting pipe. Preston, with a decade on the force, had responded to dozens of these. But today, a strange, persistent prickle ran up his neck. His partner, Stormy, a German shepherd of 200 pounds of lean muscle and laser focus, didn't so much as twitch in the passenger seat. His stillness was what made the prickle a full-blown chill. Preston slowed the cruiser as they turned onto Maple Ridge Lane, a street that looked like it had been carved from a postcard of American domesticity. Two-story colonials stood shoulder to shoulder, their emerald lawns manicured with the precision of a golf course, and a smattering of basketball hoops guarded driveways where kids would one day be taught to shoot hoops. The kind of place where the biggest crime was a rogue sprinkler system watering a neighbor's prized petunias. This normalcy was a shield, and Preston knew from experience that the darkest secrets often hid in plain sight, tucked away behind the most perfectly painted front doors. He pulled the cruiser to the curb in front of 412 Maple Ridge, a house that stood out only because it blended in so perfectly. Jonathan Vance met them at the door before they even had a chance to ring the bell. He was a man in his late 40s, dressed in a crisply ironed polo shirt and khakis. His hair was neatly parted, and his smile, wide and practiced, seemed too big for his face. On the phone, he had sounded frantic, almost on the verge of tears. Now, in person, he was a model of composed concern. That was the first red flag. Emotions, like fingerprints, rarely lied, and the man at the door was holding something back. "Officers, thank you so much for coming," Jonathan said, his voice a smooth, modulated baritone. He gestured for them to step inside. "I'm Jonathan Vance. It's my mother, Eleanor. She's just... I don't know what's wrong. One minute she's fine, the next she's so tired she can barely keep her eyes open." Preston, his gaze sweeping the entryway, didn't miss a beat. The house was spotless. The hardwood floors gleamed, and not a single dust bunny dared to float in the sunbeams that streamed through the windows. It was the kind of clean that looked less like a lived-in home and more like a staged show house. Another prickle. An elderly woman, especially one who was unwell, left behind a certain amount of clutter, a stray pill bottle, a wrinkled newspaper, a half-finished crossword puzzle. The meticulous order of this house felt like a statement, a deliberate attempt to present an image of control and normalcy. "How long has this been going on, sir?" Preston asked, his voice calm and professional. He kept his hands at his side, a silent signal that they were not here to accuse, but to observe. Jonathan's gaze flickered. "Just the last couple of days. She's normally so active. She loves her gardening. She loves her stories. But she's just been sleeping all the time. She'll wake up for a few minutes, have a cup of tea, and then she's out again." As Jonathan led them down a long, immaculate hallway, Stormy walked with a purpose beside Preston. The K9's ears were perked, his nose working, taking in the world in a way humans never could. A faint shift in the air, a scent that Preston couldn't detect, was already telling Stormy a different story. The dog wasn't on full alert, not yet. But his usual playful, tail-wagging curiosity was gone. He was in work mode, and his quiet intensity was a language Preston understood better than any human words. Jonathan pushed open a door to a sunlit bedroom. Eleanor Vance was a small woman, dwarfed by the floral comforter that was pulled up to her chin. Her face was pale and a tangle of thin, white hair framed a forehead creased with lines of worry, even in sleep. Preston could see a fine tremor in her hands where they rested on top of the comforter. "Mom?" Jonathan said softly, his voice full of feigned tenderness. He went to her side and gently patted her hand. "The officers are here. Can you say hello?" Eleanor's eyelids fluttered open, revealing cloudy blue eyes that held a brief, terrified spark of recognition. She looked not at her son, but at Preston, a silent plea in her gaze. She tried to raise her arm, but it fell back limply. Her hand gestured, not towards Jonathan, but towards a small, delicate white teacup resting on a doily on the nightstand beside her bed. It was a silent, desperate effort to communicate. Then, with a soft sigh, her eyes slipped closed again. Preston's focus shifted to the teacup. It was half full, the liquid inside a deep, dark brown. It smelled faintly of chamomile, a soothing scent that felt oddly out of place in the tense, silent room. The sight of the cup, combined with Eleanor's desperate glance, felt like a missing puzzle piece clicking into place. This wasn't a medical mystery. This was a crime scene. And Jonathan Vance's practiced smile was about to fall apart. As if on cue, Stormy took a single, deliberate step towards the nightstand. His entire body went rigid. His ears flattened slightly, his tail dropped, and he let out a subtle, almost imperceptible huff of air through his nostrils. It wasn't the excited bark of a drug alert, but a different kind of signal. It was a quiet, firm indication that something was very, very wrong. A silent scream in the quiet room. Preston's hand went to his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Preston. I'm requesting a detective and a crime scene unit at my location. We have a suspicious substance." The silence in the room was now heavy, thick with unspoken truths. Jonathan's composure had finally broken. He stared at Stormy, then at the teacup, a bead of sweat tracing a line down his temple. The look on his face wasn't one of worry for his mother, but of pure, unadulterated fear. He had been so careful to hide everything, to make the scene appear so harmless. He hadn't counted on the one officer who could read a silent language, the language of a K-9 who could smell a lie. Jonathan Vance's practiced mask of concern finally shattered. The moment Preston's thumb hit the radio's push-to-talk button and he requested a crime scene unit, a flicker of raw panic crossed Jonathan's face. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a forced, incredulous expression. "What? Officer, what are you doing? This is a welfare check. My mother is a sick woman, not a crime scene." His voice, once a smooth baritone, was now thin and reedy, a high-pitched squeak of protest. He took a nervous step back from the bed, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Preston ignored him, his eyes locked on Stormy. The K-9 had his nose just inches from the teacup, his body as rigid as a statue carved from granite. This was not the restless, inquisitive sniffing of a dog encountering a new scent. This was a specific, trained response. The faint huff Preston had heard earlier was Stormy clearing his olfactory palate, focusing on a single, unmistakable odor. The dog was working, and Preston had to give him space. He held up a hand, a silent signal to Jonathan to back off. "Sir, please remain where you are. We need to secure the area until a detective arrives," Preston said, his tone authoritative but not aggressive. He moved around the bed, keeping his body between Jonathan and the teacup. He pulled a pair of sterile gloves from his belt pouch and carefully, methodically, placed a clear evidence bag over the teacup and its saucer without touching the contents. The glass itself, he noticed, had a distinct, chalky residue on the inside, just above the waterline. It was the kind of detail a human eye could easily miss, but for a dog, it was a shouting billboard. Jonathan's protests grew louder, more frantic. "This is ridiculous. I'm calling my lawyer. You have no right to treat my mother's home like this." Preston's focus remained on Stormy. The dog had moved on from the teacup, his head low, tracking an almost invisible path from the nightstand to the door. He followed a scent trail that was a whisper to human senses, a complex symphony of molecules to his own. He paused at the doorknob, sniffed, and then made a beeline for a small, woven wastebasket by the desk. He gave the same subtle, firm alert, a lowering of his head, a slight wag of his tail, and a direct stare at the object. "He's alerting on the trash," Preston stated, more to himself than to Jonathan. "What's in the wastebasket, Mr. Vance?" Jonathan's face was now a mask of pure terror. "Nothing. Just tissue paper. My mother has a cold." He lunged forward as if to grab the basket, but Preston was faster. He stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Stay back, sir." Preston's voice was now a low, dangerous rumble. He had seen this behavior before. The frantic, reckless attempt to destroy evidence. He took a pen from his pocket and, using it as a sterile tool, tipped the contents of the wastebasket onto a clean swatch of paper he had pulled from his notebook. Among the crumpled tissues and a crumpled water bottle, he found a small, empty, clear plastic bag. It was the kind of bag used to package single doses of medication. A faint, bitter smell hung in the air, one that even Preston, a human, could faintly detect. But it was what Jonathan didn't do that was the most telling. He didn't argue about the bag. He didn't try to explain it away. He simply stared at it, his eyes wide, his lips pressed into a thin, white line. He had been so careful. He had sanitized the surfaces, hidden the evidence, but he had forgotten one crucial detail: the trash. It was a mistake born of arrogance, a fatal error in a moment of crisis. A siren wailed in the distance, growing louder as it approached. The cavalry was on its way. "You're making a huge mistake, officer," Jonathan whispered, his voice cracking. "My mother is sick. I'm taking care of her." He tried to regain some composure, to project the image of the dutiful son he had so carefully crafted. But the sweat on his brow, the tremor in his hands, and the palpable fear in his eyes told a different story. Preston watched him, his mind already piecing together the events. The overly clean house, the son's strange composure, the mother's desperate gesture, and now, the unmistakable alert from Stormy. The pieces fit together with a chilling precision. Jonathan hadn't just been taking care of his mother, he had been poisoning her. The teacup, the trash, the carefully hidden signs, they were all part of a plan to silence her. Just then, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up behind Preston's cruiser. Two figures, a man and a woman in plain clothes, stepped out. They were Detective Martinez and Detective Evans, the best in the precinct. They had a reputation for cutting through the BS and finding the truth. As they approached, Preston pointed towards the house, his gaze sweeping the scene once more, his eyes meeting Stormy's. The German shepherd, his ears now perked in anticipation of his favorite people, looked at Preston, and with a single, quick look, seemed to say, "Don't worry, partner. I've got this." The detective looked at Preston. "What do we have, Preston?" Preston took a deep breath. "It started as a welfare check, detective. Now, I believe we're looking at a case of elder abuse. We have a suspicious substance in a teacup and a son who has something to hide." And Stormy found the proof. The moment Detective Martinez and Detective Evans stepped into the house, the atmosphere shifted from tense suspicion to methodical, unwavering purpose. Martinez, a man with a stern, no-nonsense demeanor and a gaze that could peel back layers of a lie, nodded curtly at Preston. "Thanks for the heads-up, Preston. Let's secure the suspect." Evans, a younger detective with a sharp, observant eye, moved past them and spoke directly to Jonathan Vance. "Mr. Vance, we're going to ask you to step outside with us. Your cooperation will make this process much easier." Jonathan's panicked facade crumbled completely. He tried to speak, but only a gurgling sound came out. But my mother. Paramedics are on their way to check on her. Right now, we need to talk to you." "You're not under arrest, but you're being detained for questioning," Evans said, her voice calm and firm, a stark contrast to Jonathan's fraying composure. She gestured to the open front door. "Please, step outside." Jonathan, his shoulders slumped in defeat, offered no more resistance. He was a man who had meticulously constructed a perfect lie, only to have a single, silent sniff from a dog unravel it all. As he was led out, he cast a final, furious glance at Stormy, who sat patiently by Preston's side, seemingly oblivious to the chaos he had caused. With Jonathan gone, the room, once a picture of serenity, transformed into a crime scene. Martinez pulled on a pair of latex gloves. "All right, Preston. Walk us through it. From the top." Preston gave a concise but detailed rundown, his words clipped and precise. He described the initial call, Jonathan's strange behavior, Eleanor's desperate gesture towards the teacup, and finally, Stormy's two distinct alerts, first on the cup, then on the wastebasket. He pointed to the evidence bag covering the teacup and the swatch of paper with the small plastic bag resting on it. "Stormy's a narcotics dog, Martinez." The alert on the cup was a specific, quiet one for a controlled substance. The alert on the trash was even more direct. Martinez knelt by the nightstand, his gaze sweeping over the bed and the surrounding area. A cup of tea, a wastebasket, it's bold, and yet, incredibly careless. He thought he was so safe. He carefully took a sterile cotton swab from his kit and, avoiding the main liquid, wiped the chalky residue from the inside rim of the teacup. He then inserted the swab into a small, plastic field test kit. The liquid in the vial turned a deep, unmistakable shade of blue. It was a positive hit for a potent opioid painkiller. "Bingo," Martinez muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Looks like we're not dealing with an accidental overdose. This was a deliberate act." Evans, meanwhile, was meticulously examining the contents of the wastebasket. She held up the small, clear plastic bag with her gloved fingertips. "This is a single-dose bag, boss. The kind you get from the pharmacy when they fill a prescription." She held it up to the light, and Preston could see faint, microscopic traces of white powder clinging to the corners. "Lab will confirm, but I'm willing to bet this is what he used to spike the tea." The two detectives exchanged a look. The pieces were starting to fit together with a chilling, coherent logic. This wasn't a one-time event, it was a pattern. The constant drowsiness Jonathan had reported was a symptom of a slow, steady poisoning. Eleanor wasn't just sick, she was being systematically drugged to keep her quiet, to keep her in a state of unprotesting slumber. Martinez pulled out a camera and began documenting the scene, taking photos from every angle, his flash illuminating the pristine bedroom in stark, cold detail. A CSI team arrived, their uniforms a splash of functional professionalism in the now sterile environment. They cordoned off the room, their movements precise and silent. "Preston," Martinez said, his voice low, "this isn't just about the drugs. There's a reason for this. Nobody poisons their mother with painkillers for no reason. This is about control, about something she has that he wants." "The house is clean," Preston pointed out. "Too clean." "Exactly. He's trying to hide something. Let's look for a motive." The detectives' search widened beyond the bedroom. They went into Jonathan's room, a space that was just as immaculate as the rest of the house. As Evans searched a filing cabinet, Martinez systematically began lifting the mattress off the bed. Underneath, tucked inside a manila envelope, he found a stack of legal documents. They were a power of attorney form and a quitclaim deed for the house. Both were prepared and notarized, but unsigned. They had been waiting for Eleanor's signature. Well, Martinez said, holding the documents up. "Looks like we found our motive." Jonathan Vance had hoped to wait out his mother, keeping her incapacitated until she either passed away or, in a moment of lucidity, signed over her assets. He had almost succeeded, believing he had covered all his tracks. He hadn't counted on a police officer with a keen eye for human behavior, a determined K-9 partner who could smell a hidden truth, or a desperate elderly woman who could still, with a final, desperate gesture, point them toward the one thing that was silencing her. The case was no longer a welfare check. It was a clear-cut case of attempted murder and elder abuse. And the real story, the one that had been hidden in plain sight, was finally beginning to reveal itself. Jonathan Vance was led away from the house, his posture of a man who had everything under control replaced by that of a defeated child. The silence of the squad car was broken only by the static of the radio and the steady hum of the air conditioning. He sat with his hands cuffed behind his back, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery, as if seeing it for the first time. The perfect lawns and tidy houses of Maple Ridge Lane now seemed to mock his desperate, messy attempt at a crime. At the precinct, Preston and Stormy waited in the briefing room. Martinez and Evans had taken Jonathan into an interrogation room. Preston, still wearing his uniform, sipped from a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee, the smell of it a strange comfort in the sterile environment. Stormy lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, his tail thumping a soft, rhythmic beat against the linoleum floor. The dog was calm, his work done for now. An hour passed. Then two. The precinct was a place of quiet, methodical work. Phones rang softly, keyboards clicked, and the low murmur of conversations filled the air. Preston knew this part of the job well. The waiting. The anticipation. The knowledge that a small, seemingly insignificant detail could unravel an entire case. Finally, Martinez and Evans emerged from the interrogation room. Jonathan wasn't with them. Their faces were unreadable, but there was a quiet triumph in their eyes. He talked, Martinez said, pulling off his gloves. He confessed to everything. Evans sat down across from Preston, her posture more relaxed now that the interrogation was over. He was in deep financial trouble, she explained. Lost his job in a corporate downsizing and had a ton of debt from a failed business venture. He'd been living off his mother's savings, but the money was running out. She paused, shaking her head in a gesture of weary disbelief. He'd convinced her to move in with him so he could take care of her. But his real plan was to get his hands on the house. He knew he wouldn't be able to get a loan or refinance with his credit history, so he needed her to sign the deed over to him. Preston listened, his gaze fixed on the wall. He had seen this story play out 100 times before. Greed. A disease that took hold of people and made them do unspeakable things. But there was still a piece of the puzzle that was missing. Why the drugs? Preston asked. Why not just wait for her to sign the papers? Martinez leaned against the table, his arms crossed. That's the sick part. Eleanor was a tough old bird. He said she was starting to get suspicious. She kept asking questions about the house, about his finances. He knew she would never sign those papers if she found out the truth. The drugs were his way of keeping her quiet, of making her unresponsive long enough to pass away so he could inherit everything. The confession painted a cold, calculated picture of a man who had betrayed his own mother for money. Jonathan had used a potent opioid painkiller, a controlled substance he had stolen from a former girlfriend who worked at a nursing home. He would crush a small amount into a fine powder and mix it into her daily cup of tea, a routine act of love turned into a weapon. The teacup, a symbol of comfort and care, had become a poison chalice. Preston's mind flashed back to the moment Eleanor had looked at him, her eyes pleading, her hand trembling as she pointed to the teacup. It wasn't a gesture of a sick woman, but of a victim, a prisoner in her own home. She had known all along what her son was doing, but had been powerless to stop him. Later that evening, after the paperwork was filed and Jonathan Vance was booked into county jail, Preston and Stormy drove home. The night was cool, a gentle breeze rustling through the trees. Preston parked the cruiser and sat for a moment, the silence of the vehicle a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. He reached over and gave Stormy a scratch behind the ears. "You know, buddy," Preston said, his voice soft, "you're a real hero. You saved that old woman's life." Stormy looked at him, his dark eyes intelligent and knowing. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the sentiment. He gave a soft bark, a sound of quiet triumph. He had done his job. He had followed his nose and found the truth. As they walked up the driveway to Preston's small home, the streetlights cast long, dancing shadows. The case was closed, the criminal caught. But Preston knew the real story was the one that would never make the headlines. The story of a brave old woman who, in her final moments of lucidity, had reached out for help, and a loyal K9 who, with a simple sniff, had answered her silent prayer. The case of Eleanor and Jonathan Vance made the local news, a grim, cautionary tale of greed and betrayal that played out in the sanitized suburban streets of a seemingly perfect neighborhood. But for Preston, the story didn't end with a headline or a filed report. It continued in the quiet moments after his shift, in the conversations he had with Martinez and Evans, and most importantly, in the subtle changes he saw in Eleanor. After the initial shock, Eleanor was moved to a state-of-the-art medical facility. The doctors there, armed with the information Preston and Stormy had uncovered, began the long process of detoxifying her system. The small, daily doses of painkillers had built up in her body, leaving her in a constant state of a semi-conscious haze. It was a slow, agonizing process, but with each passing day, she became a little more lucid, a little more present. Preston, against protocol but with the full support of Martinez, began visiting Eleanor. His visits were informal, often in the late evenings after his shift. He would sit by her bedside and tell her about his day, about the mundane calls he had responded to, about the funny things Stormy had done. He didn't ask her about Jonathan, or the crime, or the fear she must have felt. He just talked, his voice a steady, comforting presence in the quiet room. One evening, after several weeks of these visits, something changed. Preston was telling her a story about a stubborn raccoon he and Stormy had to chase out of a dumpster behind a grocery store. Eleanor, who had been staring blankly at the wall, slowly turned her head. Her eyes, once cloudy and distant, now held a spark of recognition. She looked at Preston, then her gaze shifted to Stormy, who was curled up at the foot of the bed. A faint smile, the first one he had ever seen, touched her lips. "He's a good boy," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. Preston's heart leaped. It was the first coherent sentence she had spoken since the day they met. He leaned forward, a wave of hope washing over him. "Yes, he is. His name's Stormy." Eleanor's smile widened. "I know. He saved me." Her recovery was slow, but steady. She began to eat solid food, to sit up in her chair for longer periods, and to talk more. She told Preston about her life, about her late husband, about the joy she had found in her garden, and the quiet sadness she had carried since her husband's death. She spoke about Jonathan, not with anger or bitterness, but with a deep, crushing sorrow. "I always knew something was wrong," she confessed one afternoon, her voice a fragile whisper. "He was so kind, but his eyes were empty. They didn't have the light they used to have." Preston listened, his heart aching for the old woman. He had seen that look in Jonathan's eyes too. The emptiness of a soul consumed by greed. The legal proceedings were swift. Jonathan Vance pleaded guilty to elder abuse and attempted murder. The evidence was irrefutable, and his confession was a detailed account of his every move. He was sentenced to a long prison term, a final, public end to a private, silent crime. As for Eleanor, she had a long road ahead of her, but she was no longer alone. The legal system had provided a new beginning, a chance to rebuild her life. She was still under doctor's care, but she had a new sense of purpose. She began volunteering at the medical facility, helping other patients, and her laughter, a sound Preston had never heard, began to fill the quiet halls. The case changed Preston too. He had always been a good cop, but this case, more than any other, taught him that some truths are not found in the evidence bags or the forensics reports. They are found in the unspoken gestures of a sick woman, in the silent alerts of a loyal dog, and in the quiet strength of a human spirit that refuses to be silenced. One day, he and Stormy were assigned a new case, another welfare check in a quiet suburban neighborhood. As they drove up, Preston saw a young boy playing in his front yard, a bright, cheerful splash of color against the neatly manicured lawn. He glanced at Stormy, who sat beside him, his gaze fixed on the boy, his tail giving a soft, anticipatory wag. Preston gave him a gentle pat on the head, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. He knew that no matter what they encountered, they would face it together. He was a good cop, and Stormy was a good dog. And together, they were a force for good in a world that so often tried to silence the vulnerable. The sun set on another day in Maple Ridge Lane, but this time, its golden light felt different. It wasn't just illuminating neat lawns and tidy houses, it was shining on a newfound sense of justice and healing. The case of Eleanor and Jonathan Vance had become more than just a closed file, it had become a symbol of how the smallest actions can have the most profound impact. Eleanor's recovery continued to be a testament to her strength. With Jonathan Vance's confession and conviction, a crushing weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She was no longer a victim trapped by her son's lies and greed, but a survivor, reclaiming her life piece by painful piece. Her once empty eyes now held a spark of life, a quiet determination. She spent her days in the physical therapy room, her movements slow but steady, a testament to her progress. The laughter that Preston had heard for the first time was now a regular, joyful sound, echoing through the hospital halls as she joked with the nurses and fellow patients. Preston's visits became a comforting routine for both of them. He would bring Stormy along, and the sight of the big, gentle dog would always bring a smile to Eleanor's face. One afternoon, Eleanor recounted her time living with Jonathan. "He would always tell me how lucky I was to have him," she said, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. "He made me feel like I was a burden, that my life was a chore for him. But I was never really sick, was I? Just sleepy." She paused, her gaze resting on Stormy. "You know, he didn't like Stormy. He said he was a nuisance." Preston just listened, his heart aching for the old woman. He had seen that look in Jonathan's eyes too. The emptiness of a soul consumed by greed. But now, in the presence of Stormy, Eleanor's words held no bitterness, only a profound sense of clarity. The experience had a lasting impact on Preston as well. He had always been a good cop, but this case, more than any other, had taught him that the most important truths are not always found in forensics reports or official confessions. They are found in the silent pleas of a victim, in the unwavering loyalty of a partner, and in the quiet strength of a human spirit that refuses to be silenced. He began to see his job differently. It wasn't just about catching criminals, it was about protecting the vulnerable. He started a new initiative with the police department, working with local senior centers to educate the elderly about the signs of elder abuse and fraud. He would bring Stormy along, and the K-9 would become a furry ambassador, his calm demeanor and gentle nature a source of comfort and trust. One day, while giving a presentation at a senior center, he and Stormy were approached by an elderly woman. "You're the officer from the news," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The one with the dog who saved that poor woman. My son, he's been taking my money. I don't know what to do." Preston looked at her, his gaze kind and understanding. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll figure this out. Just tell me everything." As he spoke, Stormy nudged the woman's hand, his tail giving a gentle wag. A flicker of hope appeared in her eyes. The story of Eleanor and Jonathan Vance was a grim one, but it ended with a new beginning. Eleanor found peace, Preston found a new purpose, and Stormy proved that a dog's nose can sniff out not just drugs and bombs, but also the silent cries for help. Their story became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always light to be found, if you know where to look. Thank you for following along with the story of Preston and Stormy. We hope their journey has been as meaningful to you as it was for us. What part of their story resonated with you the most? We'd love to hear your thoughts.